Hello, I'm Ivan Henderson, Vice President of Programming at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, and I'd like to welcome you to the second day of our 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend Celebration, sponsored by Citizens. Be sure to visit us at www.aampmuseum.org/MLK to learn more about our full schedule of events, including our final day of programming on Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Service tomorrow, Monday, January 18th. Programs include MLK Mornings for youth and families, a screening of the documentary John Lewis, Good Trouble, a keynote by Dr. Nicole Fleetwood, and a special conversation on sports and activism hosted in partnership with the Phillies and Citizens. Today, we are so thrilled to present this dialogue centered on the voice and writing of Philadelphia's current poet laureate, Trepeta Mayson. Through our lens, focuses on the experiences of first-generation and immigrant citizens here in the U.S., and looks to help us all place our lived experiences within the context of our global community. Trepita will be joined by fellow author Jonathan Escoffery, and our conversation will be moderated by another incredible writer, Leesa Fenderson. Now, we'll pause briefly for a message from Dan Fitzpatrick of Citizens, and then we'll turn the program over to our esteemed guests. Thank you for being here with us, celebrating the legacy of Dr. King through the written and spoken word. And thank you for supporting the African American Museum in Philadelphia.
Hello, my name's Dan Fitzpatrick, President of Citizens here in the Mid-Atlantic region. Citizens and the Citizens Charitable Foundation have been proud partners of the African American Museum in Philadelphia for the past 15 years. This year, our support of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend helps to make the museum's online programming free and open to the public. Every year I look forward to celebrating the life and legacy of Dr. King with the museum. While this year we can't be together in person, we need to remember Dr. King's message now more than ever. The events of 2020 have forced all of us to reflect on where we are as a country and the systematic changes that need to occur. At Citizens, we're privileged to play an important role in our customers' lives, in the health of our economy, and in creating a country where everyone has the opportunity to achieve the American dream and experience it each day without prejudice, racism, or fear. We all have a responsibility to correct the mistakes of our past and pursue a society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their potential. Every January, we celebrate Dr. King's life and legacy, but we need to live his message every day. He preached and peacefully fought for equity and justice and freedom for all, and we still need to advocate for these virtues. Join me in the African American Museum in Philadelphia this weekend in listening, learning, and reflecting on Dr. King's dream for equality. The museum offers many opportunities to do just this and pay tribute to Dr. King's life and legacy. In closing, thank you to the museum staff for putting together terrific programs this year and every year. You help us remember Dr. King and live his mission of equality for all. So please enjoy this year's events and please stay safe. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm James Claiborne, Public Programming Manager at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. I'd like to also extend a welcome to you and certainly to this esteemed panel that we have. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Leesa Fenderson. So here's a little bit more about Leesa and her work. Leesa Fenderson writes fiction, nonfiction, scripts, and plays. She is working on a collection of essays and a collection of short stories. Her writing has been published online and in print in Callaloo Journal, Uptown Magazine, Moco Magazine, Nottingham Review, and she was a finalist in Paper Dart's short fiction contest. Leesa's fiction was chosen as a semi-finalist for American Short Fiction's 2020 Halifax Ranch Prize. She is an attorney, a teacher, and serves on the board of directors of Next Move Jamaica, a not-for-profit charity serving the needs of Jamaican students. Leesa was born in Jamaica, grew up in New York, and currently writes in Los Angeles, where she is a PhD Provost Fellow in the USC Creative Writing and Literature Program. Leesa, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, James. And thank you so much to the African American Museum in Philadelphia for this wonderful programming and also for having us today. So for this particular panel, we're going to be concentrating on Black immigrant writing. And I just want to kind of situate us with some of the thoughts and themes that we'll be going through today. In particular, we'll be talking about Blackness within the national and global context, the diaspora. We'll also be talking about Black bodies perpetually in motion and how that affects our identity formation, and as a result, our artistic production. Our perspectives as Black immigrant writers are constantly in flux. We're never fully in one identity. So our viewpoints are multifocal and our writing multi-focused. The artistic production of Black people in Africa, in America, in the Caribbean, the diaspora is our common intellectual project and the unifying purpose of literature. So I'm going to give you just an overview of what we'll be doing today on this panel. We'll start off with introductions to our artists, our writers today, Trepeta Mayson and Jonathan Escoffery. We'll have readings and talk about our artistic production. We'll also then move to a discussion of Black immigrant writing generally. And that's when we'll invite our audience to submit comments and shouts. And you can do so throughout the entire program. And today, if you want to submit a shout, ashe, A's, or just put some questions in the chat, and then we'll bring you into the conversation at the end. So let's hear a little bit about our panelists. First, I want to tell you about Trepita B Mason. She is the 2020 to 2021 Philadelphia Poet Laureate. She is the recipient of a Pew Fellowship in Literature, the Leeway Transformation Award, and a Change Grant, and she has received Pennsylvania Council on the Arts grants. Her work has also been nominated for a 2016 Pushcart Prize, and Mason is a Cave Canem and Callaloo Fellow and a 2019 Aspen Words Emerging Writing Fellow with the Aspen Institute. She's the author of She Once Was Herself and Mocha Melodies. Mason also released 2 music and poetry projects, SCAT, and This Is How We Get Through, in collaboration with internationally acclaimed jazz guitarist, Monette Sudler. Her other publications include submissions in the American Poetry Review, Epiphany Literary Journal, Aesthetica Magazine, Margie, the American Journal of Poetry, among others. Mason is a native of Liberia. She's a graduate of Temple University, Bryn Mawr Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research, and Villanova University School of Business. Currently working in the social services field, Mason is a member of several local organizations where she uses the arts to mobilize, build community, and create change. I also want to highlight this amazing project that Trepita has started. It's called Healing Verse Philly Poetry Online, where you can call in and hear poetry. I mean, it's brilliant, and I've tried it. It's something you should do every single day. I just wanted to highlight that. If you want to find out more information, you can always check out Trepita's website, trepetamason.com. I want to talk a little bit about Trepita's favorite storytellers. Her favorite storytellers are Toni Morrison, Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and her father. Toni Morrison's work, her unapologetic telling of Black life, inspired Trepita as a young writer and let Trepita know that she did not need anyone's permission to tell her own version of her own story and to always prioritize the telling of Black stories. For Trepita, Adichie's work, especially the story Cell 1, is so skillfully written, it's like poetry on the page. Lastly, as far as storytellers go, she remarks that her father isn't a talkative man, but once you get him started, you just need to bend your ear and he will take you back in time and school you, all while cracking you up. And what Trepita would like us to know about poetry is that for many, poetry has had a high barrier to entry when it shouldn't be that way. For Trepita, good poetry is accessible. Poetry should be well crafted. Indeed, and poets must take the time to read the works of others and hone their craft, but it belongs to all of us. Our grandmothers and grandfathers, our ancestors were poets. It just looked and sounded a little different, but it moved people and it created a space for sharing and community. I'm so excited to hear her words, but I'm going to talk us a little bit more about our other panelist, Jonathan Escoffery. Jonathan Escoffery is a Jamaican-American writer whose prose has appeared in the Paris Review, American Short Fiction, Electric Literature's Recommended Readings, Ziza Vi, Pleiades, AG&I, the Best American Magazine Writing 2020, The Caribbean Writer, Creative Nonfiction, and elsewhere. He's the recipient of the 2020 Plimpton Prize for Fiction, a 2020 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and the 2020 National Magazine Award for Fiction from the American Society of Magazine Editors. He also received the 2020 Helen Wurlitzer Foundation of New Mexico grant. He has received support, awards, and honors from the Best American Short Stories Anthology, Prairie Schooner, Passages North, Aspen Words, and the Somerville Arts Council, the Writers' Room of Boston, Kimbilio Fiction, the Anderson Center, Wellspring House, and Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Jonathan earned his MFA in fiction from the University of Minnesota and attends the University of Southern California's PhD in Creative Writing and Literature program as a Provost Fellow. And I just want to say, as I go through all of these accolades and these grants and this work that the writers have, this support that the writers have achieved, I smile through it because it's so important for us as creators to be able to build in community, right? And to have this support. I will say definitely for Black writers that our art is our resistance. And with this support and with this help, this is how we're able to produce this art and also sustain ourselves. So it was important that we read all of these different grants because it's the reason why and how we can create this art. So for Jonathan, his favorite short story right now is by Leslie Inika Arima, who was born in London and raised in Nigeria. The story is called Who Will Greet You at Home? And it can be found in the New Yorker. It begins, the yarn baby lasted a good month, emitting dry, cotton-soft gurgles and pooping little balls of lint before Ogechi snagged its thigh on a nail and it unraveled as she continued walking, mistaking its little hups for the beginnings of hunger, not the cries of an infant being undone. I read this piece, it's brilliant, you should pick it up. It really, moves in a particular way that's really, really thoughtful in terms of fiction. And what Jonathan would like us to know about fiction is that a lot of people learned at an early age that nonfiction means real and therefore fiction means fake. For fiction to be good and for it to be art, it must be unflinchingly honest. And that means that at times, for readers and authors alike, you have to accept that it may make you uncomfortable and that discomfort is requisite, both for reckoning and growth. Those are really beautiful words. And as we continue to think through these themes, I want us to really kind of sit with the idea of reckoning and growth, and we'll be able to do so as we hear from Trepeta Mayson. She's going to share some of her beautiful poetry with us now.
Thank you. Thank you, Leesa. That was wonderful. And good afternoon, everyone. I just want to thank both Leesa and Jonathan for being a part of this. We're the trio here today and to be able to share our work. I also want to thank the African American Museum and James Claiborne in particular for even igniting this idea and bringing us forward. So thank you very much. And all of you that are out here listening to us and hearing our stories, definitely appreciate it. So I'm going to share a couple of pieces with you right now. And the first piece, I'm going to just take you through a journey in the next couple of poems. And the section we're dealing with is called Arrival, but I'm going to share about 6 or so poems that'll just take us through arrival and then arriving in a new place. So I'm just going to read them all in a row. Arrival, and it's a mix of new and older pieces. Arrival. At Robertsfield Airport in '75, before the 3 of us boarded that swollen monster with wings, Junior, a dried-eyed buffoon in girl shoes, a noisy pair of Mary Jane, stumbled away from me and Dunway as we wailed and clung to Grandma Sully. There were things we didn't heed. He tasted the hot dog even before the Pam Ann roared. He seemed to forget all about cassava and a boony fish gravy as he stuffed the limp pink meat between his sore corner mouth, grinned like a fat rodent, and played with the stewardess's hair. He didn't squash his face into the porthole, imprinting Monrovia on his mind. He didn't throw a grief-filled wave at his short pant playmates. Bento boy stood patiently for my brother's goodbye, like country wives waiting for husbands who never return. He brushed past our parents at JFK, halting their drowning embrace, his eyes only chasing the finery and shine. My brother has always been searching for those things he was promised, long before our parents sent for us. when we were forced to eat the scraps, when we were swaddled in poverty, and we would mend ourselves with tales of America, America. There is gold in the streets. Everyone is fat with wealth. You can be John Wayne Cowboy, but you mustn't carry Liberia with you. Send off. Daughters, our country for all its promise tends to eat its young. If you remain here, some round-bellied old man will mince you. He will clean his teeth with your corpse. Look how they roam the villages to claim their bedmates, how they yank one daughter and then another, waving their small prey like bushmeat. See how they pluck them right off the road and out of the school halls even before they ripen. Flag them down, usher them into SUVs for hair weaves, high heels, or school fee. You are going to America now. Forget who you were and think only of who the visa you hold says you are. Your entrance in that place is a gift. It is a present many of us can't even hope to open. Live quiet there. Make something useful of yourself for all of our daughters to follow. Be something more than breast and butt and a taut stomach for gluttonous men to rest their woolly heads. Daughter, we send you off, hearts heavy like pregnant gut, like swollen Liberian plums. We have sown our wishes in the seams of your flesh. Your skin will grow so tough that jawbones will break when they try to gnaw. You are our map, and when you return, we will study you. For now, we send you off, clutching our country cloth. Our mouths follow you, daughters, lovingly art in oval pleas of go, go. Sonnet for immigrant names. Father's name is not undocumented. It's Tikwi, pronounced like a bird's call. It trips them, so Tommy was selected, benign, washed clean, palatable, made small. The middle, Lysander, Dad gave to his lone boy. Mason doesn't belong to us at all. Sometimes we immigrants invent decoys, we abridge, remove the offending wall. So you won't tire and tie up your tongue. We'll wrangle each letter till it's not the same. A strange tune our blackbirds never sung, an alias, tidied, house-trained and tame. We mourn the names our mothers gave, the ones we trampled, the ones we now crave. Native tongue. Patty asked me to speak African. It was the brutally cold February day. I had lost my one pair of gloves, my fingers curled under in defeat. My toes crunched and burned in plastic loafers. I wore a cheap coat, threadbare and burgundy with a matted faux fur hood. My backpack with a broken strap weighed down my left shoulders. My father had tried to stitch the break with his thread and needle skills. Even his deft fingers were no match for the religion and math books. Patty walked up to me so close I could smell the now and later candy. Watermelon scented puffs of air filled the space between us. I kept my mouth closed for a long time. I was just 5 years in America. I was ugly, I was poor, I was foreign. Pretty Patty with a tiny beauty mole near her upper lip, with the dancing light eyes, with the big gold knocker earrings and lovely mouth filled with expensive metals. How could she know she was wounding me? I thought, how do I speak African? How do I tell her that the place I'm from sits on the edge of the sea, on the side of an entire continent, and there English were thrust upon the people, and the people peppered and broke it up to fit their lilt. And there are over a dozen languages that sound so lovely, it beguiles. And when the people speak it among themselves, it feels like a reunion. I'm from a place where there are countless ways to say family and home and love. How do I tell her that my own native tongue, Bassa, had been quieted and abandoned upon my arrival, that my tongue was left untrained and my English straightened, the music of my dialect hushed in my own home so I could roam undetected? Patty demanded, speak African, girl, this time mean girl, brewing behind her gold crucifix. won and broke through. And though I wasn't afraid of her this time, I was a foreigner in a new land living by rules I hadn't invented. I can't be blamed for what I did. I won't be held responsible, so do not label me a traitor. I opened my mouth that day and spewed a mocked up language of lies, a succession of inarticulate mutterings, gibberish mingled with raw Liberian English, now filled that space between us, each breath a stab to my home, a performance fatigued and acquiescing. Patty laughed and laughed, nearly choking on a big gulp of air. I stood there watching her, a slight thing I was, barely a teen, on a street corner in Nicetown. Hunched by my book bag and my betrayal, she looked at me, holding her belly, told me that she didn't understand a word. Or was it that she didn't understand a world? And I'm just going to share two more. We are all trees here. They are talking about us, Mother. It's us they're talking about, Father. Us three sapo trees, one bent with a third leg, a walking stick to steady, another gone to a gout and an eyelid that droops, and me who has swallowed this entire country and later threw up its hypocrisy. We are the enemies here. That's what their placards say. We watch it on television. The fat red-faced ones, the stringy hair ones, the ones in suits and pulpits, in schools and offices with badges and gavels, the ones we feed and clean for, the ones gyrating to our music and cupping our women's bottoms, the ones with violent pens, the ones who aim and fire, waving their hatred at us, puffed and emboldened. They have knighted a leader. He is a bloated finger pointer, gesturing at us, telling us we come from poo-poo hole countries, carving an eye on our foreheads. I for, in my country you will never be safe. I for, ignore that I snatched this land. I for, I have invaded and ravaged your homeland. I for, immigrant. And all of us are lumped together as one. All of us are trees in this gutted woodland. And every day, somewhere in this country, there is someone brandishing an axe. There is someone chopping at our base. There is someone wanting to topple us. And my last piece I'm going to share is called I'll Fly Away. And it begins with just a quote from a song, I'll Fly Away by Albert Brumley. Some glad morning when life is over, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away when I die. Albert Brumley. We have stayed in this place for so long that we have erected markers for our dead. On stretches of lush lawns, split and hallowed, we weep and watch caskets shimmy down deep into the parted earth under a canopy of lilies and delphiniums and our tears. From dust we came, to dust we shall return. What to make of these hushed and swift mornings, a brief wake, a funeral, a burial without our rituals? Where are our family members shrouded in black and packed onto a bamboo mat? Where is the kola nut plate in the center? Where are the 5 a.m. scheduled cryings and bursts of wails and laments whenever a visitor stoops to greet and pay the mat fee? Where are the pounded cassava and pepper soup for us to swallow? What about the cutting of hair and the tax levied if one insists on offering only a strand and not the entire head, scraped bald, as proof of devotion and measure of how severely one is stricken with grief? What about the bath of sacred leaf water poured over the children and grandchildren for purification, for protection? For days, for weeks, the mat sitting is a system unto itself, an organized Bassa world of heaving chests and mutilating throats. There is a leader, an assigner of duties. One will rise and cook. One will sweep and clean the yard. One will collect the money from the plate and go to the market. One will dust the house and keep a watchful eye for those too overcome and consumed, too numb to move. And in the end, after the dead has been buried, before the mat is vacated, an elder will lead a meeting and demand that boyfriends marry the daughters of the families that they've been courting or cohabitating with or borning with, and demand that sisters or brothers or aunties or fathers end their palaver, their commotion, their fuss making, and all the strife and bygones be buried there with the dead into the earth. Only then will the mat be rolled away until next time. In this cold place where we have managed to make a home for ourselves, some of us will not be laid to rest in the same dirt that birthed us. We are a scattered people. On foreign soils, our corpse are housed. But some glad morning, when this life is over, oh glory, we will fly away home. Thank you.
Was absolutely stunning. I mean, it's just a really good testament to orality and what words spoken can do and how it can change energy fields. Thank you so much for that, Trapeza.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. Thank you.
So I just wanted to invite Trepeta and Jonathan into conversation about under this theme, this umbrella of arrival and the words that and the poems that Trapeza just shared with us. And so I just wanted to kind of start off with, and asking you all, how do we talk about what happens when we arrive, right? This idea of new or different, the idea of being lost, or the feeling of loss. And how do you engage with those ideas, and how do we see this coming out of the poetry?
Yeah, it's all over the poetry. This thing about arriving, I arrived here as a young person. So poetry, I found later. And then it could give voice to these feelings, and I wanted to honor those feelings because there's a delicate balance that we walk, being new in a place and then carrying a place that you've come from. So I think for me, the clearest way to show that is through the poetry, because it can take on so many voices and so many experiences, not necessarily all my own, but I can represent a wider range and reach of people.
Thank you, Trepeta. That was such a beautiful reading. I just have to say that before I give any contributions to the conversation.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Being able to touch on all of these moments as an immigrant, as becoming a new American, when were you able to articulate some of these things? And I'll be maybe more specific about one moment in your poem where we have Patty, right, saying speak
yeah.
And one thing I really love, because there are so many resonances in this poem that speak to my writing and my creative imagination. And I was just wondering, you have that moment where the speaker says, I won't be held responsible. And we're being set up to understand that she's about to respond in such a way that maybe an older, a wiser version of her may not have done. And so I'm just curious, like, I love that there's a kind of resistance in the moment, even to the shame of
Yes.
selling out your culture.
Yes.
And could you speak to that? Is that something that, did that come quickly to you? Was that something that, took a long time to kind of grapple with, reflecting on the writing? Did the writing bring you to that understanding? Did you have the understanding before the writing?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I had the feeling and the experience, right, before the writing, but the writing actually sealed it. It helped me understand. And so the shame you mentioned, I think Leesa and yourself, and I see that in your writing as well. There's this balance of the shame and the guilt, right? This whole selling out of who you are. But for me, it's so complex, because I grew up in North Philadelphia in an African-American community that I just absolutely love. And then I grew up with this this complexity of being in a place where you're not understood. Even your own family, your parents, will say things like, who who cares what they call you? You are who you are. So in that moment, what I really wanted to represent was that I wasn't satisfied with the selling out, so to speak. But in that moment, I think it's so much about survival, so much of our stories, doing what you need to do, doing what you have to do to be okay in that moment. So there's that shame, guilt, survival. It all just works together. Yeah.
I
Brilliant.
really love that notion of surviving.
Yeah.
Jonathan, were you going to say something else?
No, I was just kind of the same thing on the same tip of subjects of survival, in the way that I love that the poems Trepita read were set up to kind of bring us to the moment of arrival and the moments before arrival, and encounter in a sense with different members of the community that you are now becoming a part of, but then also the kind of broader in one of the later poems, the penultimate poem, of what the broader message that America is giving you is that despite you having maybe internalized lessons of leave where you came from behind in order to become more American, and America is telling you, we don't really care, we don't necessarily want you here.
Yes.
And so just I feel like being in survival mode in a way is what links us in a way that I find really compelling, and that's across nationalities or ethnicities, of just having to have these conversations and reflect is so powerful, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that those notions, they showed up in so many really unique and critical and complex ways in your poetry. There's this layering that happens. And I found that in particular in the sonnet for immigrant names, naming is it's so interesting and so important and so tied to our identity development. And there were these lines that really sung to me. In particular, it was, so you won't, tired and tie up your tongue. We wrangle each letter till it's not the same. A strange tune our blackbirds never sung. An alias, tidied, house trained and tamed. I mean, it moves me. And so what I wanted to ask both of you is what is it about, what's in the name for a Black immigrant writer in terms of like brand or representation or portrayal? What is it when we talk about the naming of not only ourselves as we present ourselves in the world, but naming of our poetry, of our pieces, the naming of our text. And so I just wanted to talk about naming and how that happens for a Black immigrant writer in this space where you're trying to establish yourself and not necessarily be tamed or trained. So I wanted to really ask both of you, what's your process?
Yeah, so the naming thing, even us as Black people in the diaspora, right? When you look at this legacy of slavery and names and changing names, and then even bringing it to the immigrant piece, there's so much negotiation with the name. You have to decide, if you're going to fight. Like I remember I had a good friend who, she didn't care. You're not going to chop up her name. I'm kind of the same way. I'm not into nicknames for myself. It is what it is, but to have to explain it, all the time. This times are a little different now, where I think it's expected that people put a little bit more effort into trying to say your name, or at least ask you. But before, it was just like taken for granted that whatever I call you, I have a poem like that about my parents, whatever I say it is, and then with the writing, it's so complicated, it's, multi-layered here, because there's who you are, and there's who you are as an artist, and who you call yourself, and who you want to be represented as. But even to your own culture of birth, that could be complex. That's complicated, because that's not always accepted that way. I'll let Jonathan weigh in, but it is so much with that naming.
Yeah, that is a really great and complex question. I think from the naming, my name, that to speak to that, I grew up with stories that went back to the, like, even now, if you Google like my last name, Escoffery, you might, ancestry.com or something like that might take you to a certain place in like Corsica, like uh, give you a history of French, Italian, something or another coming from Escoffier. Uh, but I think growing into my artistry, adulthood, uh, understanding that there is a certain foundation for my art and my understanding of myself, and it begins. It's not to cut history short, but it really begins in Jamaica. And
Mm.
if you look at any Escoffery who their last name is spelled like mine, they're all Jamaican, and they might live in the U.S. or Canada or even the U.K., but it was through Jamaica that they got that name. But I don't necessarily think that that is something that, let's say I am sending my work to an editor. I think a lot about the publishing world and the market facing, like your project, yourself. How are they receiving you? And so it's something that I really, when it comes to naming my work, I'm very interested in putting my stamp on exactly what ground and territory that I am comfortable and excited, really passionate about claiming. And that is, you would see that in, I have a story called Under the Ackee Tree. And ackee comes from West Africa, but it's Jamaicans who made a meal of it and a national dish of it. And the story speaks to two of the main characters' kind of lineage as Jamaicans and Americans. And it's something I wanted to, you hear different stories that are under this kind of tree, under that kind of tree. I knew I was stepping into that tradition, but I wanted to bring Jamaica into that tradition in that kind of way, where I say, like, this is what we have going on. And I think you have to be very careful about all of those decisions, including I know Leesa and I have been talking a little bit about another story title of mine that is called How to Build a Black Boy. And it's again, it's like owning that space of Blackness and coming into Black identity. And that has to do with a kind of desire to be a part of a tradition that is just so rich, and making it very clear. And so there's no mistakes before you meet me, hopefully, if you know anything about my work, like who I'm speaking to first, I guess.
Excellent. So I just want to have one more question for Trepita before we move on to Jonathan's reading. And the question comes from the poem we've been talking about, Native Tongue. And what I want to ask about is who and what is in the room with you, right? So when you write these beautiful lines, and there are over a dozen languages that sound so lovely, it beguiles. And when the people speak it amongst themselves, it feels like a reunion. And so that's in response to, this little girl asking, can you speak African as if Africa is an entire continent with endless like languages, tongues, and dialects and ways of speaking and being. And so this line, when people speak it amongst themselves, it feels like a reunion. It just gives me goosebumps. It's incredible. And so what I wanted to ask is, in what ways are ideas about the diaspora in the room when you're crafting a poem? What ways in which is there a reunion in the spaces with you as you're creating your work?
Oh, in all ways. One, I am very careful because the telling of stories from the continent, particularly from Liberia, there you find very little of that telling in the global, on the global landscape. But the other part is I don't want to just tell, it is very important to tell the Ebola story and the poverty stories and the women. A lot of my work is very women, gender heavy, like, really speaking out for the women and girls. But I'm very careful because I want to, even in the most painful stories, I want to be able to balance it with the beauty. So in that experience with Patty, and there's so many of those Patty experiences for so many of us, where someone says, speak African, or speak Patois, speak Jamaican, speak this, as if it's just this one thing, right? I wanted to be careful to put in there two things that I wrestled with. You know, I'm Bassa, which is one of the 16 ethnic groups in Liberia. And when we came to America, I was pretty young. I was about 8 years old. And my parents didn't do it on purpose, but, you know, we were undocumented for a very long time. So they wanted us to get English. You know, Liberians speak English, by the way, but it's a heavy accent with English. So they didn't speak Bassa in the home, and I lost that language. So in one way, there's a grieving. I'm grieving the loss of that. And even now, when I speak to my niece, I always tell her, please, please, please teach me this language. I beg her, teach your children this language. So that's the one. And then the other two is the wrestling with the two sides. You know, I am very much, you know, that, you know, Liberian woman, that African woman, but that African American woman who also had the balanced experience in America of growing up in an African American community where I was one and am part of that community. So I wanted to make sure that we left Patty in a place where she needed to understand more of this world without wounding her back, right? But then I also wanted to deal with the fact that I'm mourning my language. And then I want to deal with the complexities of a Liberian culture that despite what's all in the news, there are so many beautiful things. And one of them, that language. When I go back home, and you could be in a room with people representing various ethnic groups, and they're all speaking the language, but we're all one, we're all united as one. So there's so many things. That's what's in the room with me. At the end, I want to be honest and I want to be fair, in that representation. And no matter what us as writers do, it might not land as fair, but that's what I go into the room with. I want to have a balance.
Absolutely. And I think that's incredible. It may not land as fair, but the thing about writing is that it's reciprocal, right? You go back to it and you reevaluate and then you become better, right?
Yes.
And so your writing, you should be looked at as a totality, right? Your entire span of writing, right? Not just in a particular moment. And so with that, thank you so much. We're going to turn it over to Jonathan, who's going to read us a piece. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before I begin, I just want to say my thanks to the African American Museum in Philadelphia and to Trepita for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event. And I think it was a really great segue in terms of, you might hear an artist read one poem that touches on one specific angle of their experience. And but there are just there's so many angles, especially when your lineage is coming from one place and you're situated in another physically. And I think this piece I'm about to read kind of speaks to some of that. It's from a story called Influx, and this is a condensed excerpt from a much longer piece. And so this is basically going to be one of those many angles that we're talking about. It begins with, "What are you?" hollered from the perimeter of your front yard when you're 9, younger probably. You'll be asked again throughout junior high and high school, then out in the world, in strip clubs, in food courts, over the phone, and at your various menial jobs. The askers are expectant. They demand immediate gratification. Their question lifts you slightly off your pre-adolescent toes, tilting you, not just because you don't understand it, but because even if you did understand this question, you wouldn't yet have an answer. Perhaps it starts with, "What language is your mother speaking?" This might be the genesis, not because it comes first, but because, at least on this occasion, you have some context for the question when it arrives. It intends to separate you from the norm. You immediately resent this question. "Why's your mother talk so funny?" your neighbor insists. Your mother calls to you from the front porch, has called from this perch overlooking the sloping yard time and again since you were allowed to join the neighborhood kids and play. Always, this signals that playtime is over. Only now, shame has latched itself to the ritual. Perhaps you'd never noticed. Perhaps, perhaps you hoped no one would notice. Perhaps you never noticed it yourself. Perhaps you ask in shallow protest, what do you mean, what language? Maybe you only think it. Ultimately, you mutter English. She's speaking English before going inside, head tucked in embarrassment. In this moment, for the first time, you are ashamed of your mother, and you are ashamed of yourself for not further defending her. More so than to be cowardly and disloyal, though, it's shameful to be foreign. If you've learned anything during your short residence on Earth, you've learned this. It's America, and it's the 80s, and at school, in class, you pledge to one and one flag only, the Stars and Stripes. Greatest country on earth is the morning anthem. It's the lesson plan, a mantra drilled into you day in, day out, a fact as inarguable as 2 + 2 = 4. And what you start to hear as you repeat this to yourself is the implication that all other nations, though other nations are seldom mentioned in school at all, are inferior. You believe this. It's an easy lesson to internalize, except that your brother Delano, your parents, nearly all of your living relatives are Jamaican. When a cousin you've never met moves from Kingston to Miami to your Cutler Ridge neighborhood, winding up in your 3rd grade class, refusing to pledge allegiance to your flag, you know to distance yourself from her. You say a quiet thanks that your last names are different. If you'd had any context for the question of what you are when it first came, you might have answered American. You were born in the US and you've got the paperwork to prove it. You feel pride in this fact, this inalienable status. You belt Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA on the 4th of July, and even more emphatically after visiting your parents' island nation for 2 weeks in your 7th summer. You disagree with every aspect of the island life, down to the general lack of central air conditioning. You prefer burgers and hot dogs to jerked or curried anything. Back at home, your parents accuse you of speaking and even acting like a real Yankee. You don't like the tone inflecting it into something disgraceful, but if by Yankee they mean American, you embrace it. I speak English, you respond. Your parents' patois and what many deem an indecipherable accent still plays as normal, almost unnoticeable against your ears, except that it is increasingly paired with the punitive. For instance, when your mother says, "Una can spill the thing on the table and I can't clean it," and your brother says, "No me, mommy," and you say, "I didn't do it, mom," she'll say, "Then who did? Must be a duppy." The duppy becomes the scapegoat for all of the inexplicable activity that takes place in and outside of your house. The duppy broke your mother's vase, then tried to glue it back together. The duppy hid your brother's report card underneath his mattress. The duppy possessed your father, dragged his body out for drinks after work, and didn't bring him home until morning. A duppy, or ghost, or even a grown man can be difficult to discipline, and so you and your brother alone share the punishments. In school, when your world geography project is announced and you're made to choose from a list of countries to present on, you choose Mongolia. It's not till another student chooses Jamaica that you consider the tiny island a worthy option. Part of your project requires preparing a dish native to the country you've chosen. This is 4th grade. Your mothers do the cooking. When they meet each other on presentation day, eyes ring dark from having wrestled with foreign recipes late into the night, they nod imperceptibly, too exhausted for pleasantries. As your classmate begins her presentation on Jamaica, your mother sucks her teeth, a sound akin to industrial strength Velcro ripping apart, drawing glances from several of the other parents. "We could have brought in leftovers," she leans in and whispers, "if only you chose home." On career day, your father stands in front of your class and identifies himself as a general contractor. The block letter alphabet strung along the edge of the blackboard arcs over his wavy black hair. Below the arch, he unspools a foot of measuring tape with the tip of his thumb, then releases it, causing the tape to zip back into its case. The sharp whiz emitted by the swift violence of the retracted tape gains your classmates' undivided awe. Your father repeats this action several times before deigning to speak. Your classmates hold their breath in anticipation. As he explains that When man need them bathroom fix, is me get all the plaster and PVC and ting, and is me make the worker man come nice up the place. A string of snickers breaks out from the classroom's back row. Your teacher shushes the students quiet, but as your father continues his speech, her face crinkles, head bobbling to the beat of his patois. You concentrate on the pink surfacing over her cheeks, the color spectrum helping you determine the magnitude of this disaster. If she remains a light pink, a shallow blush, a rose petal, a ballet slipper, you'll know this is a faint debasement to be forgotten in the weeks ahead. But as her skin brightens, flashing past punch, nearing violet, you recognize this as catastrophic. You question why you didn't insist your mother come in your father's stead. She knows better how to iron out her words for American ears, as she must for work every day. Earlier in the week, you asked her about the details of her secretarial position. From the edge of your bed, your mother explained that she works in the office of a company that ships jet engines internationally. The hem of her nightie shimmied as she skipped around the room to pull down the globe atop your bookcase. You see here, and this here? She kneeled at your bedside, pointing to Germany, then Brazil, then to the chain of Hawaiian islands, singing, "We go all around the world," dancing her slender index and middle fingers across oceans and lush green continents before lifting them to tap your nose. "We," you asked her. "You don't get to go to these places, do you?" Your mother blinked twice, then walked the globe back to its shelf. "Someday," she said. "Someday, maybe when you're all grown up." She added, "Better you ask your father to visit school. Him, they'll find exciting." In your 5th grade history section, you learn more about the founding of America. You learn about the subject referred to simply as slavery. It's an abbreviated, watered-down lesson, much like its subject heading. It's mostly good people made a big mistake. It's that was a long, long time ago. It's Honest Abe and Harriet Tubman and MLK fixed all that nasty business. It's now we don't see race. An air of shared embarrassment infiltrates the classroom during this lesson. The students agree this was a terrible event. You're mildly aware that some of your classmates are supposed to have descended from the perpetrators of this atrocity, and that some descended from the victims. You're not quite aware that many descended from both. Should you feel slighted by this country you love so dearly, once again, you feel yourself tilting into uncertainty. This is not the first time you've heard of the transatlantic slave trade, as your father never misses an opportunity to denigrate your country of birth. In his boisterous version of the lesson, you learn, that's why these black people act so. I'm come out of bondage not 2 seconds ago, now they must act civilized. Boy, I tell you, white people wicked, you see. At the height of his lecture, he'll add that slavery in Jamaica ended hundreds of years before slavery ended in America, a claim you'll later learn is off by hundreds of years. He has a word, a Jamaican word, for the blacks of either nation he deems inappropriate, boto. If ever you do something that might cause him shame, he'll say, you can act like real boto sometimes. Your mother says to you and your brother one day, "When a better no bring them nappy-headed girls home." In your mother's defense, or perhaps to further disparage your mother, her list of girls not to bring home will stretch to the point where you'll wonder if she ever wants you to bring home girls. "Don't bring home no coolie," she'll start to warn in middle school. Upon seeing your uncut coffee-colored Panamanian prom date, she'll lock herself in her bedroom. For her, your mother will have no words at all. And after you graduate, she'll say, please, just not a white girl. Promise me that." But this is 5th grade still, and you're confused about this first warning. What constitutes nappy hair to your mother? You study her guitar string follicles, then study the cotton candy curls on your head. You wonder about your own hair's nappiness. You wonder who can't bring you home. I'll stop the excerpt there.
Brilliant. Every time I hear your words and read them, I'm just blown away by what you're able to accomplish on the page. In this piece in particular, it being in flux and the title being so appropriate, the piece itself is in flux. You feel and you see the tension, the back and forth that the second person narrator is going through. It's really wonderfully done, and I'm so excited to be able to talk about it. So I want to start off talking about the title, In Flux, and how does being perpetually in flux affect your writing? And I say perpetually in flux because as far as I'm concerned, identity formation is something that's continual. I'm reading your piece, and I was just home with my parents, Jamaican, and so much of it is continue to be in flux and in conversation with who we are as people. So I wanted to know, like, how does that being in flux perpetually affect your creative sense of self? Also, in light of the fact that you have a second person, more mature narrator speaking to a younger version of himself. And so it's like the influx continues on the page in so many critical and layered ways. So if you could just speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I think it was important to me to tell a story in second person so that we do have that older, more mature, still fallible, but a character who has a brain that has more perspective on the world and what this young character, as we're meeting him, what he's going to go through. And so there is that "what are you" question that he had no context for, he starts to have more context for. And yeah, I think that's a really great point in terms of the fact that our identities are constantly in flux. And so I wanted to talk about that moment as he's stepping outside of his house and he's realizing that to some of his neighbors, his parents are incomprehensible, like they can't understand them at all. And does that make a character, then does that make a human lean into their supposed Americanness, or something that's more palatable for people outside of their home? So I wanted to track that. But then, as you start to learn about the history of this country as an immigrant, or certainly as a child of immigrants, that is a very quick way to propel you to start to try to understand, like, well, what else is going on in the world? Like, was it, some of this is just so ugly. I want to know, like, was it as bad in Jamaica? Was there anywhere on earth where colonialism didn't touch? And so you start to lean into maybe a period of Black Americanness, that as you are becoming Black American, African American, you're feeling that maybe your own household isn't the place where you're getting part of that identity. But if you can find acceptance in an African American identity, sometimes I think the story at a certain point starts to make fun of the fact that we lean so heavily into that we're just mimicking what we might hear on the radio or possibly see on TV when we see ourselves at all. And then that bounced back to, well, now I'm going to be super Jamaican and all I'm going to do is dress in black, gold, and green, everything. And, I'm going to affect an accent and I'm going to do all that. And I'm going to say, my history was over there. It's not over here. And so I wanted to really write about all of those kinds of, or as many as you can in one piece of writing, that constant bouncing around. And the story ends when this character is about to come home from college. But I mean, it's like you said, Leesa, that journey never really ends, and even your understanding of the journey, because I could go home or even just hop on a call with my mom, and some understanding that I have about Jamaican culture, she might be like, what are you talking about? Like, actually, like, this is actually what it is. And that will now reframe my entire understanding of what I thought I knew. And that's why I think I was really interested in that point you made about survival, because it's not necessarily about owning, mastering one thing, but it's about maybe mastering this this crucial survival mode that we have to be in. Yeah.
I was going to say, just even from reading the story and then hearing you reading, it's just such a lovely story. And there's so many connections. I mean, I was picking up on these themes with the poems, where we were talking about rival, wrestling with that whole guilt, and then the family, and then trying to make yourself, some just understand who you are in this new place.
Right.
And I just thought you did that so artfully, like talking through the voice of this, all these little scenes. In your reading, in your work, are you often finding that even when you read this, that just like I find also people who are not even a part of your culture are able to identify with these experiences and to be able to point to moments and themes and things in your writing that it takes them back there. I just wanted to kind of understand your experience, because I think sometimes we feel like it's just us, particularly in that young voice and some of the young voices that I have when I'm writing my work, but it seems like we're in this little bubble, but there's so many things that impact that.
I think that's such a great point that I never really considered at all until the very first time I gave a reading of this piece. And just to situate further our audience members, this is something that I wanted to have a kind of foundation for a character who you're going to see over and again in a linked story collection that I have that's in progress, and this is the beginning of it, and I wanted to have a kind of foundation for that. And so it's the first story that I wrote and published that I was hearing back from, I think because it won a contest, they got a little bit more play, a little bit more of an audience. And I was hearing from people with all kinds of backgrounds that were saying that it really resonated with them. And I think, almost anyone who kind of spends a period of time in one community and then goes to another community and then realizes, oh, like it's the whole world is not just that one place I came from. And who are you now in relation to where you came from and where you are now? And that's been just really a beautiful surprise. Yeah.
Excellent. I wanted to kind of talk about encounter, right? What happens when you're here and you are perpetually in flux and you just encounter versions of yourself. And so one of the things we talked about before was this idea of consciousness, right? And what I wanted to kind of think about with this idea of triple consciousness, but to put us kind of in the mind frame of it, it comes from a term that W.E. Du Bois coined in The Soul of Black Folk, that was double consciousness. And so Du Bois defines it as the Black person is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, a world yielding him no true consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Black person, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Du Bois, a poet in his own right, really kind of captures this idea of this two-ness as being a Black person in America. And what I want to talk about is kind of this tripleness, right? Being a Black person, dealing with the kind of larger normative society, and also being an immigrant, and how that kind of that triplicate, the idea of being in a space of three, how that affects our writing. And then also how it affects your engagement with the audience. And this is for, both for Trepita and Jonathan, but just thinking about this kind of triple consciousness and how we kind of measure that and how that shows up in our work.
So I think the double consciousness, I think, is something that I probably felt earlier on than the triple, right? Because again, until I was able to really get these poems and really give voice to this otherness, this experience in the community that I grew up in the communities that I was kind of often around coming up, until I opened my mouth, I was a part of the African American experience in America until I stated that. But for me, and I identify that way. But the triple consciousness, I think, comes as almost another piece. It might be quadruple. because you're a Black person, you're experiencing life through this lens, but then again there's this other side of you too that brings together this whole world, this whole other culture. I think the conflict there is often you don't have an opportunity to fully flesh out that triple piece, because there's so much heaviness, there's so much with the other part, and to live in a country like America, you're constantly battling through the other part. So it's almost like, you know, um, I almost hear the voice in my head like, okay, we're all one people here. So why are you bringing this other piece when we're all dealing with the same level of atrocities, here and also, in the diaspora, out in the global sphere. But for me, I'm not, I feel it now, those parts. I don't know that they're equally weighed, and I don't, and I think part of that is complex for me. It's still I guess, an ongoing dialogue. I'll be interested to see what Jonathan.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about Langston Hughes, his the Negro artist and the racial mountain,
Mm.
um, and in a sense because I think it speaks to double consciousness. I actually just pulled it up, and if I could just read really quickly, one of the most promising of the this is Hughes, by the way, and I recommend any of our audience members, this is out there if you want to Google it. It's again the Langston Hughes, the Negro artist and the racial mountain. Uh, Hughes writes, one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, "I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet," meaning, I believe, I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously, I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that, I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself.
Mm.
And, the piece goes on and just touches on so much that's really still relevant today, about, classism, colorism, expectations on the artist. But it's a piece that I came to, um, in my late 20s, really, and or maybe mid 20s, and it's something that really cemented for me a kind of quiet conversation that was in the back of my head, that I feel like I'd been asked the kind of that same question, like, well, do you just want to be an author, or do you want to be a Black author? With this idea that being a Black author is somehow going to limit you. That seemed to be the implication of the question. And if you read the piece, you see, it's if if you're not engaging with who you are truly, then there's this kind of emptiness that comes into your prose. And that's what I was discovering early in my writing, was that there was a point in my artistic journey where I think most of who I'd read were white authors, because that's what was put in front of me in school. And then even if you brought in our kind of scope of media, you're watching it on TV. There was a point where I thought I could write a white character better than I could write a Black character, because they're being put in front of you so much. It wasn't until really college where all these great, because I sought it out, all these really wonderful African American authors were put in front of me, and I started to be able to understand that I can situate myself in a tradition, and that became really, really rich for me. But at the same time, I have to put that same lens on it and say, if I'm writing a boy growing up in an African American household, where the parents are African Americans, I'm still using my imagination. I'm still basing that on what I've read and what I've seen on TV, maybe. And so I had to really think about, well, why is your writing's coming off stilted? It's because I don't know, because I don't know some of these experiences. And so I was raised by two Jamaicans, and that was my experience. And so I wanted to lean into that. And to me, that is really when the writing became became real for me, became alive on the page. And I know that's like an angle on the question that's not necessarily answering the whole of the question. I think revision is where I come back and I think, well, how does this read to Jamaicans on the island? How does this read to Jamaican Americans? How does this read to African Americans? And how ultimately is it going to read when it comes across the white upper middle class editor when it comes across their desk, if I'm asking that question. And I think that's where I have to start to again. I don't think the creativity is not blooming out of that question, but I do have to think. And I know it would sound cooler and it would sound braver to be like, nah, I don't care about, what any of these, what anyone thinks, but just giving thought to how these words are going to play in different people with different experiences. I think it can sharpen your work, if anything, because you're not changing it to pander, hopefully, but you're saying like, no, this is just truth that I'm bringing you.
That's what I was going to say. For me, I have a little bit more of the resistance when it comes to thinking about all these different players and how it will land on them. But because, as you said, Jonathan, as long as it's authentic and it's not, some parody of people's lives or not making things up, as you said, and, having this empty story. But as long as it's authentic, I find that I'm able to be freer as an artist in the writing if I let go of some of that. Because one of the things that I think you and I both realize, no matter what, you're always going to find someone, whether it's from your culture of birth, where you find yourself, or even out there in this literary world, who are not really going to be into anything you're writing. So it's very difficult to try to mine all of these playing fields, and I just it's a fatigue, that you'll get. So for me, I'm pretty resistant with it, but I know that there are certain doors that if your writing is going to enter those doors, you do have to give some consideration to all of these pieces.
That's brilliant. I want to ask one more question before we turn to questions from the audience. And I wanted to go to a line in Jonathan's piece that I thought was so resonant. And even the way he read it and ended on it I was like, this was such a pivotal moment. And it's the morning where the mother character has stayed up and prepared like this Mongolian meal. And the other characters, other children in the class were able to bring in kind of Jamaican meals. And the mother says, we could have brought in leftovers. She leans in and whispers, if only you chose home. And so that thing of choosing home and what is home? It's a home in the body, it's home in actual physical place, a brick and mortar place, it's home in the arms of, the person you love. And so the idea of home and it being so many different things is really, really interesting. And I wanted to, just because I wanted to bring out another Black immigrant writer, Edris Danticat in Black Bodies, Emotion and Pain. He wrote this amazing piece. It's called Black Bodies, Emotion and Pain for The New Yorker. And it was in response, she wrote it after a shooting of Black churchgoers. And she says that human beings have been migrating since the beginning of time. We have always traveled from place to place looking for better opportunities where they exist. We're not always welcome, especially if we're viewed as different and dangerous, or if we end up, as a novelist Toni Morrison described in her Nobel lecture, on the edges of town that cannot bear our company. And she asks, will we ever have a home in this place, or will we always be set adrift from the home we knew, or the home we have never known? And so I think there she's asking so many critical questions, the home we've never known. I feel like I go to Jamaica, I land there and I'm like, I feel home, but I grew up in America for most of my life. And so I go back to Queens, I'm like, oh, this is home. I'm New York, this is my home. And so home is in so many different places before I put on some music, and that feels like home. And so this sentence where the mother character says, if only you had chose home, was just so important because it was a question of choosing it. And so I wanted to ask how we think about choosing home, and if we were ever have this home, if we will ever really know a home, and how that shows up in your work.
Mm. That was such a beautiful line too, Jonathan. I mean, I will never forget that line. Um, yeah, I think I made peace with the fact that there are a couple of places, when I say home in a lot of my conversations, when I go home next year, or the people back home, I'm referring to Liberia, because that's where my parents and I are from. That's where the land is. That's where all these things, that's where I can go despite what you read in the news about it, and feel surrounded and loved by just all of these Black people, right? But then in a sense, I feel a true connection to my experiences here growing up since I was, 8 years old. So for me, I think I'm at peace with the fact that in these two places, I can call home. I don't know that I can choose one at any given time, because it's not so much tied here. It's not about the land. If for here, it's about the people and the experiences, and remember, and our history and our ancestors also. So I feel full circle, at least when it comes to the experience here and then Liberia. So I've made peace that, I'm holding my hand up like this because I feel like it's a balance for me.
Yeah, that's a question that haunts me. It forever kind of haunts me. The question of home, not in a. I grew up in Miami. Miami is home. Um, the stories my Jamaican parents told me, in a sense, is it's more home than going to Jamaica. Although when I go to Jamaica, I can say the last time I was there, about 5 years ago, or maybe a little more now. I stepped off the plane and I never felt more American. But by day 3, I felt like I breathed easier than I'd ever breathed in my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And just being surrounded by Black people, by people who sounded like my parents too, and just it was just so beautiful. And that's not to say, there are certain realities of, we're uncomplicated, then I would just move back to Jamaica where but it's a lot more complicated than that. But I love the Danticat quote, because it reminds me that, at the same time I was learning about, we're learning more about Langston Hughes and this movement in the 20s that we know as the Harlem Renaissance. There was a Claude McKay, there was a Jamaican writer and poet. There was a Marcus Garvey on the scene, trying to link us all with Pan-Africanism. So there's a continuum that I think us as Black writers, we have this great privilege of being a part of. Even to bring it out of writing, I have a great grandfather who I grew up with stories of him, who this would be my mother's grandfather, who moved when he was pretty young, moved to the U.S. and became a doctor, and played his part in starting Black hospitals when other hospitals wouldn't see to our community. And so there's it's not always as simple as I rocked up and I was the first American born. It's more complex than that, and there's more ways in which we Black immigrants have also contributed to this country for a long time, and being part of that tradition, the writing tradition, to me is just super special, and to me that's a great place to call home.
Excellent. I think we can squeeze in one more question, and I think of this, one of my favorite poems by Louise Bennett is Colonization in Reverse, and she's writing about the Windrush generation and that everyone leaving Jamaica to go to London. And she writes, "One island, what a people, men and women, old and young, just to pack them bag and baggage and turn history upside down." And so what I love about it is the idea that we are kind of like turning history upside down and creating for ourselves a new space. And so we talked a little bit about where we want to be and where we want to situate ourselves. And I wonder about situating ourselves in the larger diasporic canon, and how do we do that? Like in your writing and your work, how do we situate ourselves in terms of including thinking about translation? Do either of you, and in different forms of translation, translating a story? And it's reminded me because when Jonathan said he was speaking to his mother, and he's like, oh, this is how it went down. And mom's like, no, that's not it. It's bigger than that. We're more complex. We're a little different. And I think about how certain things just aren't translatable. So I wonder how we find ourselves in a particular canon if some of our work just isn't translatable.
Yeah, yeah. I think it goes back when I was talking about the resistance piece, right? And the who will read and who will understand. And sometimes there's a piece of it you just have to leave on the floor. And when I say that, I mean there's a piece about gaining acceptance or understanding. So some things are just not translatable, and you can't. You just have to say what it is, and you don't have to explain. And again, I think, I don't know, the older I get, the more I try to do this thing. I want to be authentic to the words and experience of the people. And where it doesn't work, I'm going to leave it alone. And sometimes it's not my story to tell. So sometimes I can exit out of that too, but when it is my story to tell, if it's not going to fit into some other tongue, I'm going to put it in the tongue it's supposed to go into.
Yeah, I love that. I think there's also a kind of, I know in Jamaican culture, what I've observed and what I've talked about this with other Jamaican Americans, is that there's a lot of, it's like this. I may talk to an editor, let's say I publish a story and it goes into a magazine, and the editor comes back and they're like, yeah, this is all great, but I have a question. Why doesn't your character just ask his parents, like, what's going on in a certain situation? And for Jamaicans, like, we don't, like, those questions, like we're brought up to not ask those questions, and we're also like, we don't get those answers sometimes, or we have to kind of find some kind of sideways into getting the information that we need. There's a kind of communication block in some ways when it comes to like certain subjects. And I think for me, and I understand this is fiction, so you can have your character do anything, but if I see, like, no, that Jamaican son, like, there's no way in the world he would ask his father this question, I just have to get back to the editor and say, if it's a piece of information that can come out another way, then we'll figure a way around that if it's necessary. But otherwise, I think that's the thing I leave on the floor. It's just like, there are certain modes of communication that Americans have that, coming from the Jamaican background, like we don't do that, and so I have to just be okay with that.
Absolutely. Did either one of you have any last words? I'm going to turn it back over to the African American Museum in Philadelphia. But before we do that, I'm just going to wrap up.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Leesa. You were such a wonderful moderator, and Jonathan, just brilliant to be able to share this stage. And I want to again thank the African American Museum of Philadelphia and James Claiborne for just providing this forum. There's a lot for us to think about, and we have to come back for part 2. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to thank Jonathan especially for inviting me to be a part of this. It was really an incredible experience, and just in the short time, I'm sure I've grown as a writer. So thank you so much. So if James, I think you wanted to pop back on and close us out with final words.
Yes, my first 2 words are thank you, Trepita, Leesa, and Jonathan. This was an incredible conversation. It's amazing, Trepita, thinking about our first conversation and what has grown from that. Thank you for your words. Thank you for your dedication to craft, to lifting up voices, and cracking open kind of our lived experiences for us all to see each other. I think if anything else, I wanted us to come out of this conversation and be able to see each other. And you guys have done such an incredible job with what we had to hear today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to our audience. Our celebration centered around MLK, sponsored by Citizens, continues for one more day. Tomorrow you can join us starting at 10 a.m. for MLK Mornings, which is programming for youth and families. We'll have readings of Dr. King's texts. We'll have a Dreamline workshop where youth are able to do an artistic activity that's all around dreaming up possibilities. Adults are welcome to participate in that as well. And then in partnership with Smithsonian, we do have a transcribe-a-thon where we'll learn more about how you can participate in translating historical documents for the Freedmen Bureau for Smithsonian. So please check that out, along with the documentary John Legend, John Lewis, Good Trouble. Finally, we'll have Nicole Fleetwood doing an MLK lecture. And then we'll close out with a special conversation on sports and activism with the Phillies. So there's lots happening. You can find out about all of this at ampmuseum.org, MLK. Thank you all for being here, and good night. Stay safe.